Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you all for joining us today. At our webinar, we will talk about the Kalcium Quickterm and memoQ integration. But before that, let me start with a little housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on our site. It will take approximately 1 week to have it there, but we will send you an email about that. The webinar itself, the presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and then we will have a 10-15 minute QA session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the QA panel on the Zoom window. Let me introduce our presenters today. From Kaleidoscope, we have Klaus Fleischmann here, and from memoQ, we have Jure Dernovšek presenting you this amazing and interesting topic. Klaus, Jure, I hope you are here and you are fine. So let me pass the mic to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm here and I'm fine. I hope you can hear me fine as well. And let me grab the share. I'm not in Zoom that much, but that should work. Right. So again, yes, welcome to the webinar. And just a brief introduction on who Kaleidoscope is. We have not yet presented very often together with memoQ, so it might be interesting for you. Basically, Kaleidoscope, our claim to fame is taking your content global. So we help companies that have global content in the areas of translation, terminology, but we also go a little bit in front of translation, so to speak, from a process point of view into helping you set up your content, digitalize your content, modularize your content, etc. And we are also active in the area of automation. Today is about terminology, and we will talk about our recent integration between our, let's say, flagship product Kalcium Quickterm and memoQ. We're also integrated into other systems, of course, and we also have other modules on our platform. But the focus today will be on terminology, Quickterm, memoQ. So very briefly, why are we even talking about terminology? What do we mean when we talk about terminology? And I always like to quote this colleague and friend of mine, Uwe Mügge, who some of you might know, although he's mainly active in the US. But basically, I like the way he defines the term base. He defines that by the collection of words. And the important thing is that matter in your organization. So it's really about the words, terms, we would call them, and concepts, of course, in terminology that are important. So those include starting from product names, components, features, processes, things that are really special in your organization and people wouldn't understand unless they were part of your organization. And what is terminology management, the topic of today? Well, Uwe defines it as the process that somebody does to provide guidance on word choice to authors and translators. So basically he says, well, what the terminology manager should do is they should guide people who create content and help them to choose the right words. Put a little bit differently, we would say that, okay, in terminology, everything is about consistent and correct usage of language, essentially, but terms, words. So for example, here a screenshot of our system with some demo data from one of our customers that we will also be using today. So essentially they said, okay, we want to standardize, we want to consistently call this thing here the single piston brake caliper. We'll spell it like this. We won't spell it with the number 1. We won't call it one pot brake caliper either, even though that sounds very intriguing actually. But no, we want to focus and concentrate and harmonize on this way of putting the term. At the same time, they want to make sure that if somebody uses this term, they are actually referring to the right thing. So this is the correctness side of it. And in a term base, we normally achieve this by including things like explanations, images, definition, other metadata, maybe classification, maybe putting it into a taxonomy, into a concept relation network that we call concept maps, or things like that. Oops, sorry about that. I never have my phone on. That's interesting. And of course, in a term base, we want to do this in all languages. So we would have equivalents in German, Japanese, Spanish, Hungarian, obviously, or whatever other language you want to do. We do this simply so that the content we produce, the information we produce, is readable, understandable, user-friendly, so we don't frustrate our users with unintelligible content. Recently, there has been a few trends that are really boosting the importance of terminology. One of them is content marketing or digital marketing. And what you focus on here very much is search engine optimized writing, findability. And at the end of the day, that has to do with terminology. So if you find out that people in a particular country are not finding your products on your e-store or on your website, it could be simply because the term you are using there is not optimized for this target audience. That means they're actually Googling for something else and thus not arriving on your content. So here terminology, I would say the first time ever, actually has an influence on the revenue that we do. And that, of course, is a big upswing or a big boost. Terminology is also very important, obviously, as most of you know, because most of you probably have to do with neural machine translation. But in any kind of AI project, whether we're building an automatic smart tagger of content, or we're building taxonomies or knowledge graphs, or whether we're building a chatbot that uses these things, terminology is always really important. You notice that when you use an NMT engine that is not trained, the things that will be most problematic is terminology. And last but not least, if you use a content management system, which probably all authors are using nowadays, even in marketing, websites are not written anymore in Dreamweaver and things like that, but they're written in a content management system, which is fragment-based or modular. So that means you write a little snippet, but you don't really know on what page this will land. And of course, if you don't control terminology there, it is very unlikely that a website that is assembled dynamically based on 10 snippets will be terminologically consistent. So there we also need terminology when we create the content. So that is all quite obvious, but what does it look like in an enterprise, in a company? Either you are an enterprise or your customers are enterprises. So for example, here, one of our customers invented this little thing here. It doesn't really matter what it is, but the question, of course, is what is it called? And depending on who you ask inside that company, you will get many different answers on what this thing is called. And as a translator, you're aware, or you know these situations where you're like, well, is that actually the same thing, or is that something else, or what is that? And why is that? Well, simply because in an enterprise, product development or any product that is built or developed or programmed or whatever, it goes through different departments, different divisions, and there we have human beings that have, let's say, different sets of mind or different ways of looking at the things in the real world. So, for example, the research and development department who first came up with the idea that said, oh, well, it would be really cool if we could detach this controller from the machine and walk around in the room with it. So they call it a detachable controller, because for them, the most important thing about this, which really differentiates it from all the other controllers, is the fact that it's detachable. Then you might go into engineering or software development, depending on what kind of a product you have. And there, of course, people think about, well, what's important when I build this? How is the building or the programming or the algorithms behind it, how is that different from similar things? And then they will naturally call it something like battery operated HMI, which stands for human machine interface, because all of these things are HMIs for developers or engineers. This one is special because it's battery operated. And then you have product management who says, well, it needs to fit in my product line. We already have FRC 10 and 20, so obviously this is going to be 30. And then very often the tech doc department who puts together information for the end consumers, and this information is often based on the input from these other departments, they very often say, interesting, why are you calling this thing differently? Are we all talking about the same thing? And by the way, I don't think your terms are nice. We need to think about our user, and they don't understand HMI and they don't understand FRC. So let's call it remote control. They will all understand it. Marketing says remote control is cool, but we have to spell it like that and trademark it immediately so that we can run our campaigns. And of course, as I already mentioned, increasingly customers are also thinking about, well, what does the user actually call it? Why? Because increasingly, if this thing doesn't work, the user will simply pull out his smartphone and then say, why is the remote controller not working? And then hopefully they will find your content and not some fake documentation that might exist about it. So this is what we want to do. And what is keeping companies from doing that? There was an interesting survey from TermNet which asked about the 3 biggest challenges for terminology management in large organizations. And of course, we have consistency and accuracy, but we have all these other things. We have lack of awareness, basically no resources, and we have no process. And a lot of these things is exactly what QuickTerm wants to take care of also. So this awareness, low entry level to terminology, but also having an efficient process around it. So what's the solution to this dilemma? Of course, it's concept-based terminology. So that means we first create a concept. We say, okay, well, there's this new thing. This is what it is. This is how we define it. We are going to call it, if possible, remote control. It's okay to call it FRC30 if you refer to the actual product, so one particular instance of this remote control, so to speak. If you're writing search engine optimized text, remote control with a camel case and all glued together would also be okay, but all the other names that we found for it, we want to reject those. And of course, to come up with this concept and agree on the concept within an organization or an enterprise, that requires a process. And like any other process, a terminology process will have some sort of an input. We will look at that in a minute. Then there will be some sort of a validation process. So typically you have somebody responsible for validating these things. I try to avoid the term terminologist because many companies don't have a terminologist and they don't want a terminologist, and HR doesn't even know what that is. But they will have somebody in charge or somebody responsible for validating this input in this new process that we introduce. Maybe they have help. So maybe for certain subject matters, they can bring in some specialists. And then when they have created the concept and they think it's okay in our vision of how all this should work, it gets sent out into approval. So that basically means all the divisions that are in my company and are participating in harmonizing the terminology, they approve it and they say, yes, this is fine. Or they say, no, this is not fine. But they also need to tell me why it's not fine. And of course, this then goes into the target languages where we have even more people involved, and we're having it reviewed and approved in the target markets by the target language reviewers or in-country reviewers, whatever you call them. That's also obviously very important because 80% of all the problems in translation that reviewers stumble across have to do with terminology. So that's where a lot of the efficiency can also be gained. So what does this look like if you embed this into the localization process, which is the title of our webinar? So basically, if you have a localization tool like memoQ, there are several entry points or ways to jump onto, let's say, this terminology process. You could start with the terminology extraction. Jure will show us in a minute what that looks like with memoQ. You could run a systematic collection, of course. So you could sit down and say, okay, we have a new product or a new, I don't know, content product, information product. We're going to really read through it and systematically get the terminology out of it, or work out the terminology of a particular subject field, for example, by doing really systematic terminology work. Or what you could also have is you could have spontaneous contribution. So that means a translator, for example, is translating a text, comes across a term that is not understandable or new or worth putting into the term base, then they could suggest that immediately. In memoQ, they could do what's called a moderated, you could have what's called a moderated term base. So you can basically suggest something, but it's not visible to anybody else until somebody approves it. And for example, we could take those inputs that we have here, no matter which ones really, and pull them into our process in QuickTerm, which is our really strong part of QuickTerm, is this ability to have a process. We would validate it collaboratively with the subject matter experts on the client side. Then we would go into approval, and then of course it would go into our central term base. And from there, we can then distribute it. And of course, today we are talking about memoQ. So from there, we would distribute it out to memoQ. And if some new terms come in, we would also distribute those out again to memoQ, always the delta. So we don't always overwrite the entire term base. We really only did distribute the delta that was added, changed, or deleted. And then from there, how do we go into the other languages? Well, similarly, if we have an English term base, we can either take it offline. So very often this is actually brought offline. You export it into an Excel file or something that you can easily fill out offline. We import it back in. Or the QuickTerm, of course, also supports translation tasks. So we can create a translation task. I'll show you in the live part of today how that actually works. Or again, we can have a moderated term base where translators can enter suggestions, and all of these things we can then again take into our validation and approval process so that everybody agrees on it. In this case, for example, well, everybody who's part of the supply chain. So for example, if you have 3 vendors, make sure all 3 of them buy into this new term, but you can also send it into the target country to have the reviewers review it. And of course, it updates the term base, and from there it updates, in our case, memoQ again. So with this short intro, Jura, I'm handing over to you, pretty much on time, I think, I hope, to look a little bit at the originating phase of this. So how a localization tool can help in getting these inputs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then let me share the screen. Can you just confirm, please, that you can see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So yes, thank you, Klaus, for this great overview. So now let's start at the beginning. So terminology creation. In some cases, we receive terminology, or we have a terminology at hand that we can use when we start translating a new project. If that's not the case, fine. We can still work. We can still work and build the terminology actually from scratch. So take the material that you have, maybe legacy translations or some similar translations, and then feed it into memoQ, and then we can create a terminology suggestions that can be then sent over to QuickTerm for let's say validation. So, and how can we actually build terminology from scratch? There are actually 3 ways how you could do this. So what we see here is a simple project. We have 1 file that we have uploaded, and what you could do is you could go to the preparation and here pick the option to extract terms. So this option is available natively. You don't have to install anything separately. So you can simply click on that. And then you can also, if you have already done some terminology sessions, you can continue with the session, or you can start a new one. So what we can do then is we can choose from where we will take our terminology suggestions. So as you can see here, you can use your translation memories, or you can use the documents to be translated, or live docs. So live docs are repositories of bilingual documents or language pairs. So imagine you are starting with a translation, and then you would like to upload your old translations, so source and the target, into live docs, and then you can from there export terminology that could be then validated. So for this exercise, we will just take the document, so translated document, and then we can also fine-tune the result list by defining the conditions for term candidates. So we can say here how long should the terms be. So here we can say 4. They shouldn't be longer than 4 words. We also need to specify the frequency. So how often should these terms appear so that they are treated as term candidates? By default, we have here 3. So then you can also say expression delimiters, which could also be, I mean, this is already going into detail, so you can leave the delimiters there as they are. And also the length factor, you don't need to change that. What is more important at the beginning are single words terms. Here you can say how short should they be. So here we have 3 characters, and what is the minimum frequency of these terms, potential terms. And here we have by default 3. Now, this is a default setting. And actually, there is no one setting that would fit all the cases. Like if you would imagine, you can have a very complicated term appearing only once, and with this setting, it wouldn't be caught. But if you set here something to, I mean, if you set here 1, then this will also list all the terms that are false positives, basically terms that shouldn't be there, or just words that shouldn't be there. So it is a bit of a trial and error, and you will see the results, and then you can adjust to fit. Then you can adjust this to get the desired result. So you can start with the default settings and then fine tune it, or actually run several sessions. That would also be possible. And then if you go to the lower part, we also see here this setting, stop words. Now, for some languages, the stop word lists are available. So you can just click on the menu, and if something shows up, you can select it. And what does this do? It gives you a list of words that should appear in a specific position if it's treated as a term. So here, if you check the check marks here, let's say a word about is allowed in between 3 or 4 words, but it's not allowed to be used at the beginning or at the end. And you can also think about a term that would start with about or above or across. So usually that's not the case. If you have such cases, you can adjust this. So you can remove the check marks, and you can see there is a pretty extensive list, and you can also add new stop words. So, but what this does is it actually helps you narrow down the results so that you actually get the term candidates. So we will do that. Click on OK, default settings. And now we get the following list. Now what we could do here, I would suggest that you go through this list quite quickly and pick the term candidates. We can say that hot start is a term candidate. So we can accept it by clicking on Control Enter. KTM is not, so we click on Control D, which is drop term, or you can also use these commands here. Choke, we can say, okay, term candidate, range, no, engine, no, hot start, no. So like that. Then you can also sort the entries so that you get the ones that are accepted as term candidates on top. And then you can also, in the bottom, see where they occur. And here you can then already type the translation if you find it, or also add source examples and target examples. Now in the bottom part, you can also run concordance, which will actually display all the entries. I mean, this is basically concordance. So it will display all the parts where this text occurs. And yeah, we could enter here translations. Now there may be a question if the target terms would already be populated. So the target terms would only be populated if they would occur in a term base that we also could use in the term extraction session. So imagine you would like to come up with a list of terms for the client. So you can use some reference documents that they have sent you, plus a glossary. And then you can automatically also get terms that would be available in the glossary as well, so that you really narrow down the terminology for the specific project or the client. Okay, so we will not do that here, but because we'll enter translations in QuickTerm. Now, to pass over these results to QuickTerm, we can use this option, export to Excel, like that. And then we send over the results to QuickTerm. This time manually, so, and it will happen. It will happen in the backend, so we don't have to simulate sending emails because everybody knows how that works. So now I would like to pass on the floor to Klaus, so to show you what you can then do once you receive this list. Klaus, the floor is
thank
yours.
you. I will end yours, and hopefully it remembered my position. Yes, it did. So, okay, so we saw memoQ has a terminology management function, of course. So why do we need QuickTerm on top of that? What does it add? So, well, when it comes to terminology management, of course, QuickTerm also can just edit terminology, maintain terminology. But what we are really strong in is workflows and processes. So I will show you what we would do with the term requests that came in from Jira. And our workflows are all collaborative workflows. So that means you can assign tasks to other users. We can chat with each other. We can send information back and forth, and everything gets stored in the system. So in 2 years, if we wonder how did we come up with this funny explanation, we can then go back into the term base, and we can see all these conversations that we have. QuickTerm is also built so that you can easily roll out terminology in your company or for your client if you are doing this for a client. So you can enable people to search the term base, find entries, again, collaborate and raise awareness a little bit. What we can also do, and this is very important, particularly if you are the client or if you want to help your clients adhere to terminology, we also have terminology verification in the source language. So not only in the translation, but in the source language. It's a morphological terminology verification module that we have. So we understand declensions, we understand plural, we understand composite nouns, all of that. And we have a context-aware verification engine. So that means if a term is allowed sometimes, but other times it's not, then we can configure that, and you can tell the tool I am now writing, for example, marketing content, and that means other terms are allowed, which are not allowed if you write technical documentation content. And then last but not least, integration. This is a big part, and this is actually the whole topic of this webinar today. We want to get terminology closer to the user. For example, if you are a translator working in memoQ, well, we want the terminology to be right there so that you can use it. Right, so I want to show you a little bit what this looks like. So I have prepared a little bit of a demo system here. So what you can see now is our dashboard. As I said, one of the things we want to do when we roll out terminology in a company is we want to raise awareness. And one way of doing that is to not immediately scare people away by ugly interfaces. So our UI is extremely customizable. Here it's coral red with our native Kaleidoscope logos and some button labels, but you can change all of that to match your company colors, your fonts, your logos. You can even change all the labels on all the buttons, etc. And for example, what you could do, I'm currently logged in as a terminologist. So for example, in my main menu, I have lots of functionality. If I were logged in as, let's say, a developer or an engineer or something, for example, I would have only the dashboard and maybe the terminology tab, but nothing else. In order also to decrease the fear for terminology that sometimes our colleagues have, or people inside our customer, we have things that we kind of learned from social media. So people enjoy these posting kind of things. So we call this the entry of the week. So you can post entries of the week here that explain interesting terms from your company or your products, or maybe even other interesting terminology stuff, explains that to the users. And users enjoy that. It's kind of like scrolling through an Instagram when you have 3 minutes at the traffic light or whatever, hopefully when it's red, like our UI. Then you can scroll through this and maybe you learn 2-3 new terms from your company, and everybody enjoys doing that. Or if you want to take it all the way, you can run term quizzes. So you can invite your colleagues and say, we have a new term quiz, come test your knowledge about our terminology, compete with each other so you can track who needs how long to answer the questions and how many are right and how many are wrong. And of course, this also immediately teaches your users about the terminology, because you can then explain why is it not this, but this, or this one is an easy one. Or you can also do things like KTM, for example. Everybody needs to know what the Dakar Rally is and when the first one was and how long it was, etc. And that KTM is the most successful motorcycle brand of all times in this rally. So these things are interesting to learn, but they're also important to learn. Of course, we can also search. So for example, I could go in here and I can search for the 2-stroke engine, which is one of the entries that I have in here. And then we are also very customizable in the way we display terminology. So for example, here we have it in kind of this list format. Some people like that, others don't like that at all. But what we make very, very clear is, okay, you searched for the 2-stroke engine written like this. It's actually written like this. Why? Because the 2-stroke engine written like this is actually not an allowed term. So we can display this here. And of course, in terminology verification, we can also catch that. But you could, if you want to, you could display it only like this, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then you can drill down if you want. Or you could go all the way and say, for example, here, complete table, show a lot of information in a completely different kind of view. You can have videos and all of that, of course, in here. So always very customizable. You can go even further. That's what I meant when I talked about searching, but also finding. So we do support things like concept maps, for example. where you can navigate around and you can say, okay, a two-stroke engine is one sort of a combustion engine, but maybe there are other combustion engines. Then I can double click on here and oops, there we go. Then it jumps to the combustion engine, and then I can go back down to the four-stroke engine. So if I was looking for a very particular kind of four-stroke engine, for example, then I can find it here by navigating up and down. Or even by just going into a taxonomy. So we can also have a taxonomy where you have a hierarchical view of everything, and you can say, show me everything in the term base that has to do with engines or brakes or something like that. As I said, we also do terminology verification. So you can either do this directly here in the browser if you have absolutely nothing installed, or we have plugins. So for example, you could have a plugin into Word where I have this text that you already know from Jira. And if I run a term check on it, I will see that actually there's a lot of mistakes in it. And then I can go through here, click on each of these mistakes, and it will actually also tell me, well, what is the correct thing? So the four-stroke engine is not correct. But it's spelled with a hyphen. That's actually the difference here. Or the hot start control cable. Okay, that's also the cold start knob, for example, should be called the choke knob. So this is terminology verification. Let me close this. No, don't need to save it. And come back a little bit now into the workflow. So of course I got these two extracted terms. So these are two inputs. It could also have been that a translator suggested something. It could have also been that some user of QuickTerm was searching for something, couldn't find it, and then they said, oh, I want to request this because it's actually really important. So here I have these two things that I imported from the extraction result. So I have the choke and the hot start, and you will see we have a task list. So on the left-hand side, we always have all the tasks that are assigned to me. If I select this filter, nothing changes because they are all assigned to me currently. So I could now go in and I could edit the hot start. So I could go in here and I say open, and now I have full access to all of my fields in the term base, and actually Salt, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce that name. Sorry if it was wrong. I now have access to all the fields. So for example, here I have things like a subject field that I could add, or I have things like, I don't know, a segment that I could add. So this is off-road, for example. I have definitions, I have, I don't know, notes, things like that. On term level, I also have a great deal of fields that I have available. The term status actually is a mandatory field. And then I could, for example, save this. It warns me that I didn't enter a definition. It's okay not to enter a definition, but it would be nice to have one. So I can still say yes. But for example, to take you a little bit into what we can do in the workflows, I could now go in and say, well, I'm not the expert on hot start procedures in engines. I have somebody in my technical department who knows about this, and I want them to give me a definition. So I can go in here and I can do what we call assign this for somebody to edit. I don't actually want the term status from them. What I actually want from them, oops, in English, is the definition. So what I'm doing here is I'm delegating this to a particular user. In my case, I'm going to delegate it to my tech talk team. I can even give them a deadline if I want to spam them with reminder mails and etc. And I'm restricting them to really only access the definition. So please leave everything else alone. I already researched this. Please don't destroy it. Don't delete anything. Just please give me a definition. I can send a comment along. Give me a def. I can send an attachment if I have a PDF or something. And then I send this off into a workflow. And now to show you what happens, I actually need to log in as a different user. So I'm going to log in as this TED person, who is my tech talk person. As you can see, a lot less functionality. Why? Because TED is not a terminologist. They can't really do much other than work on the things that I give them as a task. And again, I have my task list on the left side. By the way, there's a lot of metadata in the task list. So I could say, well, I don't actually want to see so much. I only want to see the keyword, for example. And then I see, okay, hot start I have to work on. What do I have to do? I have to provide a definition. I can communicate with my colleagues and with the terminologist. So I could say, sure, 1 sec. Or I could, for example, also send a mail to some, or not a mail, it's not a mail, it's actually a chat comment in the system. There is an email in the background that gets sent off. So for example, I could now ask top management what they think about this or something like that, and then get the answer. And all of this is stored. That's the nice thing. It's not lost like in another chat or an email. In 2 years, if you want to know what we discussed, it's still there. In this case, I'm simply going to go in and I'm going to write a definition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in writing this definition actually, and then I'm going to finalize it. And with this, it actually already goes back to my terminology process owner, or whatever you want to call this. So now they got my definition. And in our view of the world, the terminologist always moderates the process. So I can now decide, is this okay? Do I accept this as a definition? If so, I can import it. And actually, if I'm happy with this entry now, I can create it in our term base, and then it gets created in the term base. Yep. And I can finalize the term request. So I can send a message, thanks for this request. In this case, it doesn't make a lot of sense because this came from a term extraction, so it wouldn't notify anybody. But for example, if this was a translator that wanted this or suggested this, I can now inform the translator that it's done. What I can also do, of course, I can send this into approval. So I can say, okay, everybody from marketing, from tech doc, from QM, from whatever, do you all agree with this entry? So I could go in here and I could say, assign this as an approval task. By the way, all of this can be automated. So I can also say, well, if I have a new entry, once a day, look into my term base. If you have entries that, for example, have at least one preferred term, and I don't know, the workflow status has reached this and that level, then please automatically send it into approval. And again, here we have different workflows. So I could have a very simple one. It only goes to Ted. You already met Ted. He says yes or no. Or I could say it goes to Ted first, then it goes to somebody in marketing, then it goes to somebody else to be finalized, and then it actually returns to me as a terminologist. So I'm just going to do the simple one now and just send it out. By the way, of course, the process status is updated automatically. So now in here, if I refresh, let me just refresh this. Yeah, actually, I need to show the entry. So here I would say, for example, it's now provisionally processed. And once Ted goes in, and I have this task now to approve this. So I can see, okay, this is what I have to approve. You will see I have no open or no edit or anything like that, because I really only want to approve it. If I disagree, I can say reject, and I can put the reason here why I reject it. But for the demo, I will just approve it now. And then actually nothing changes except for the status. The status now gets set to, it is now finalized, I think, or I'm not even sure what that is. What was it? Hot start, I think, something like that. Yeah, so the process status is now finalized, for example, and this is the compact list, so I cannot see everything. So then we can see everything. We also store the history, of course, so we know exactly what happened with it, who voted for it, who voted against it. Now what I could also do, I could send this into translation. So I don't only want hot start in English, I want this to be available also in German, for example. And again, this can be automated. I can say, if I have something that is finalized, every Monday morning, check if we have at least 10 new entries, and if so, send them out into translation. Oops, didn't want to click on here, but I didn't any. No, I did actually. I clicked on send this off by email. Sorry, I don't want to do that. I want to assign a translation task. Again, you can have several workflows. So I have one workflow here that sends all languages into translation with no verification at all. Or I have one for all my main languages where I say it goes to a translator, from there it goes to a language lead, from there it goes to a reviewer. Again, these workflows are completely customizable, so it depends on how you want to set this up in either in your company or together with your client. Again, I can send a comment along that goes into the chat box. And if I now log in as a translator, I should have a task here. Yes, I do. So I have a translation task. Again, I could reduce the amount of information seen in the task list. So I'm supposed to translate this into German. I can open it here. And then what I get is, split screen. On the right-hand side, I see the entire concept, everything that exists and that I have access to. On the left-hand side, I can edit my German. Very important, I'm completely free. So I could translate this as only one term. By the way, I can look up if there's something similar in the term base. So we have all kinds of hot start stuff. Don't get confused that I have everything twice. That's because I have two flavors of English. So I find everything twice. So apparently Heißstart is the correct term for hot start, because everything has Heißstart attached to it. So I could enter that, but of course it's not the Knopf, it's just the Heißstart. And then whatever you allow your translators to do, they could, for example, add synonyms if you have synonyms in German that you want to add, or I can have them add other fields on the term level. For example, a term status should also be preferred. Maybe I can have them add a definition, a note, whatever you allow them to do. And then in my workflow, I don't create this in the term base immediately. I first send this to, we call it main translator here, and the workflow, it was called language lead, whatever you call it. So it now gets continued in the workflow. At some point, this is all done. So let me go back here as a terminologist, and I just realized that I did a mistake in the demo again, Jure, because I created this as British English, and we are synchronizing US English. Let me see if I can, sometimes we can say change this to a different language. In this case, we can't. So let me just briefly add it here as US English, otherwise nothing will get synchronized. It's the preferred term. Then I save this. Can I save it? Yes. And then, of course, we synchronize this over to memoQ. This is the integration part. So how does that work? Essentially, we have an automation framework in our tool. I repeatedly already said this can be automated. So this is where all the automation magic happens. And for example, here we have a task that is called publish to memoQ. And we can schedule this task. So we can set this to run every hour, once a day, once a week, or not schedule it and always run it manually. But of course, the idea is that this happens in the background. As you said, Jure, everything happens in the background. Also importing the term requests from memoQ, that happens in the background via a shared folder. But for the demo, I'm going to run this manually. So I'm going to click on run. And theoretically, it should now find one term that it synchronizes back over. If I open the log file, see where it puts that. Okay, it found one entry. This is exactly my hot start that it created, and it created what we have as entry number 71 is entry number 195 on the memoQ side. We remember that, of course. So if I change hot start later on and we synchronize again, we would actually update the memoQ database. And yeah, at this stage, back over to you, Jure, to show how this arrives and what this looks like now in memoQ.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So let me then share the screen. Okay, now back to the project. What we now will do is connect actually to this database. And since this database is on the server, we'll find it here. And this is the one. And you can also check here, we have 64 entries, so we can select that. And now how this will be displayed, we can see in this document. So you can use this will work in the browser interface or in the desktop application. And the terms, so here we see some suggestions from the alignment, but what we want to do is check the terminology. So terminology in memoQ is displayed in blue colors or in black colors according to your setting. And if we check the right side, we see a couple of terms. So the blue ones are approved, the black ones are not approved. So now if we would suggest a term that is somehow rejected, ISDT, for instance, you can also see that when you start typing, the typing assistant will suggest you the terms that are approved. So if we now, for instance, try to confirm just this one, we will get here a warning. And this warning will tell you that we have a couple of issues, but this one is important. So this is a forbidden term. So we can also make sure that only the approved terminology is then used. Now, if we want to also check the details of the terms, we can do that. So here you can see what is available related to the terminology that we have. So we are now mapping specific fields only using the standard terminology module. If you would wish to have more information displayed, this can of course also be done. So just let us know. And for some integrations, maybe even QTerm will eventually be needed just to have the possibility to map the custom fields. Still, the terminology work can be, of course, done in QuickTerm. Now, if we would want to suggest a new term, there are two ways how we can do this. Either we go to QuickTerm and we suggest terminology there, or linguists can also suggest new terms. And here, what we can do, for instance, let's say, yeah, something like that. We can suggest terms with translation or without translation, and then put it into the terminology. And in the terminology database, we can have a special status field that can say draft terms or approved terms or rejected terms. And then in QuickTerm, we can only pull those necessary, let's say, draft entries and make them available for validation to the terminologists. So this is how linguists can work, and validators can work then in QuickTerm. And as said, this is also available to do in the browser. So this is how you can really keep the terminology available, not just to linguists, but also to I mean, linguists translators working in memoQ, but also terminologists, or actually people that need in your organization or actually outside of your organization access to terminology or benefit from it. Could be authors, could be validators, could be subject matter experts in-house, or outside of the company. So everybody can have access to terminology. It will be consistent and improve the quality of the text. So this is how memoQ and QuickTerm can really provide you an overall solution, a good solution, a comprehensive solution for your terminology needs. So from extraction to validation to publishing and making it available to colleagues that are just using it and not contributing it. So this would be the end of our journey. Now we would do the translation. We would export the document, and that would then complete the translation phase. Of course, terminology phase can then still happen. It's an ongoing process. So, but this is how you can really establish a very great terminology workflow that is embedded in translation or your other works. So now we are just on time, so we have still at least 15 minutes of time for any kind of questions. And now we can check the Q&A and the chat. So maybe Damian or Benson, have you had a chance to maybe?
Yes, Klaus answered nearly all the questions that come
Sorry, yes.
into the chat. But no, thank you very much for doing that.
But there were so many questions that I said I'm going to go ahead and start answering them.
But we have so many great questions in the Q&A part as well. Great long questions. So you might want to open it, but I will read them out as well. So Jeremy asks, I'm curious whatever QTerm includes any term extraction features that work in bilingual text like XLIFF or monolingual text, or if memoQ or Kaleidoscope recommend any commercial available or open source term extraction tool that works reasonably well for any language bilingual tools and works smoothly with the QuickTerm-memoQ workflow.
If you want to process source documents and get suggestions on source terms, then term extraction is a good fit. Now, as said, you can also use bilingual XLIFs and extract terms. Now, how will it work for CA/JK languages? That's a good question. We can take it offline or check locally for best practices. We have some colleagues that are that are working closely on that. If you are here suggesting to have a tool that would also suggest translations, and now this is what memoQ does not do. And I said it only does suggest terms if it finds them in an available term base, readily translated. So, but it does not have a language processor that would feed the terms as well. If there are any third-party solutions, I think there are, but I wouldn't dare to recommend any, especially for CJK languages. Yeah, we can take this offline, or maybe Klaus, if you have any input on that one, or any experience on that one.
I don't have a default recommendation for an extraction tool. Very often those are very language combination dependent. So if CJK is what you're looking for, then most likely there are tools that are specialized on exactly those language combinations.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Damien. Is there a good frequency based on word counts? For example, 3 times in 1,000 word document may be good, but 3 times in 100,000 word document may not be so good. Is there a rule of thumb to use here?
Well, that's a good question. 3 times in 1,000 words. You know, even like one. I mean, the term that appears once can be really crucial, but you miss it for some reason because it's not appearing at least 3 times. So I would say the rule of thumb is the default. I mean, the starting point, the default settings are fine, and what we are doing here is we are really trying to cover the base. We will not get 100% match, I mean, results as we would wish. But if we manage to cover, let's say, 90% of the potential terminology, that's already great. So I would leave it at the default, yeah, work from there. It really depends, because you can process, I don't know, catalogs where these terms will really repeat like often, or medical texts. But then, I mean, here you can really use this 3 times per 1,000 words, let's say. But yeah, if you are dealing with something more exotic, then the term can actually have and shorter text, then the term can actually appear only once. But the question is if that's so crucial to tweak, or you would just like, when you are translating, how you spot a term and then you add it as a suggestion on the fly. I would say it's you can start with the default settings and then handle exceptions when you translate for such case. That's how the term extraction is actually designed or scoped. So not to cover all, but to give you the solid base, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think I would add that there's a lot of research actually currently going on in using language models and all of these modern MT and AI things that are happening also for terminology extraction. As far as I know, all of these are kind of still projects. There's a lot going on in Europe in the LTI consortium, for example. I know that there's stuff going on in Asia, so I'm expecting that there should be products coming out of that fairly soon, like in a year or two. But there really is, let's say, ground research going on this, because the frequency, for example, the modern tools, they would compare frequency of particular words compared to the frequency that they have in everyday language. And that would also then catch something that is only once in the entire document, because if it never appears in general language, then the frequency of 1 is also way beyond that. So I'm expecting a lot to develop there in the next year or two. We're also working on something, by the way.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Paulina. Does the morphological function supports Polish, for example, during QA?
Yes, Polish is supported. We support approximately 30 languages with QTerm for the terminology verification that I briefly showed.
Thank you. Our next question is, will this type of term recognition change the way the terms are entered in QuickTerm for translation in memoQ?
I think what you are referring to is those special syntax, or I'm not sure what you call them, morphology fields in memoQ. You can still do that. So in the demo we didn't show that, but of course it is possible to model the QuickTerm database to include those that information, and then you can pass on that stemming information and all of that to memoQ. So you can still work with that method as well, of course.
Thank you. The next question is, does the analysis verification feature have any integration with general purpose web apps or any specific tools other than Microsoft Word or Microsoft Outlook? For example, Jira, Confluence, or any support for IDEs text editors used by developers who write code, comments, etc.
I'll also answer that one. So yes, we have browser plugins. So we have a plugin into Chrome and Edge and Firefox. So you mentioned Jira and Confluence. Confluence, yes, works out of the box. Jira needs a little bit of tweaking because the browser actually doesn't know where to find text in a Jira ticket. So if you have a text editor in your browser application that the browser actually knows this is a text editor, then it works out of the box. If it's a form field, you need to do some tweaking and explain which form fields to check in. We also have a clipboard integration. So basically, if you are in Notepad or something like that, and you highlight text and press a shortcut that you assign yourself, then we will just check what's in that highlighted text. You can fix it in our client and then paste it back to the source application. Particularly for developers, we also have an integration into Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. I think that covered all the ones asked.
Yeah, I think you. Thank you very much. The next question is, does it work with standard term-base as well as QTerm?
Yes, it works both.
Great, thank you. And do the terms entered in memoQ publish or synchronize with QuickTerm?
By default, currently not yet, but we can make a back synchronization. So that would be, or maybe Klaus, if you would explain how this could work.
Yes, so in our, let's say, a little bit arrogant view of the world, QuickTerm would be the leading database. And everything that you want to change, you would change in QuickTerm. And from there, we distribute it out to other tools like memoQ, for example. So in our version 1 of this integration, let's put it that way, we only implemented the mono-directional sync, but it is a delta sync. So we actually track all the changes and we only synchronize the changes. So it's not a complete term-based export-import every time. But we'll see. It kind of depends a little bit on the market and adoption rate, and then we can take this one step further.
Thank you. Let's continue with a longer question. Just to clarify the translation workflow, translation of terms themselves isn't done in memoQ, right? My understanding is that you either run term extraction in memoQ, then export to QuickTerm for approval, then publish back to memoQ, QTerm term-base, or suggest or translate terms within QuickTerm UI, then publish back to memoQ, QTerm term-base.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. I mean, you could do translation of terms as well in memoQ. That would be a problem. But it depends on the workflow that you set up. So if you say that terms are always handled through QuickTerm, then yeah, that's the way to go. Technically, I mean, it is possible also to do that in memoQ.
It also depends a little bit on your expectation, I think. So I showed you how the translator can rather freely add fields or add terms. And if you want that kind of a functionality, then I think you would be better off actually using the workflow inside QuickTerm. But if you have more of a, let's say, word list approach to terminology, then certainly you could, for example, export an Excel file out of QuickTerm, translate that in memoQ, and then import it back in. And then you have the translated terminology.
Great, thank you very much. And we have one last question. Is there a way of importing a QTerm or memoQ term base into QuickTerm?
Yeah, that's a simple one, right? So you can do that. Yes, you don't need to have term extraction. Basically, when you run the term extraction and then the export of the Excel, that's actually a similar form that you would get if you would export a regular or a QTerm database, where you can use TBX, multi-term, CSV form. So yeah, it is possible without term extraction.
Yes, and of course we have the complete mapping functionality in the import as well. So in the export, I actually answered this question in the chat. So we can map all the fields that we have. As you probably saw, we have a lot of fields, but then we only sent, I don't know, 5 of them or so over to memoQ. And we also mapped the names. So what was called subject, I think in our term base, was called domain in memoQ or something like that. So we can map these fields with a visual field mapper, and we can also do that during the import. So for example, if in your TBX file or CSV or Excel or whatever you have a field that is called, I don't know, domain, but you don't have domain in QuickTerm because it's called something else, then you can simply map it and say, well, it should be this field. And you can also map the values.
Okay, thank you very much. And one last question came in, and I think that it should be the last one because we ran out of time. If terms are deprecated in source language in QuickTerm, will that term be highlighted in the source segment in memoQ?
In the source, no, but you would see it in the translation results. So for instance, here, you can see that for 4-stroke engine, we have the blue one, which is approved. And this will actually, I mean, the source term will be highlighted here, but you will not see the black translation be highlighted in the target. As soon as you try to confirm, though, this forbidden term, then you will get a warning that you have used the forbidden term. So then you can, of course, do the modification, change the term, and use the validated term.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for this amazing and insightful presentation, guys. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a lovely rest of the day. So again, thank you very much for everything and have a lovely day.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
me as well.
And take care.